Welcome to the last session of our conference today. We are honored to have some distinguished presenters among us. My name is Amy Lindeman Allen. I'll be the moderator. I teach New Testament at Christian Theological Seminary. And our presenters are Dr. Angela Parker, who is a professor at McAfee School of Theology. Dr. Adam Braun is a professor at Pacific Lutheran Theological School. And Dr. Isil Yoon, who's a professor at our host institution, Yonsei University. And so we are looking forward to hearing each of them speak. We will begin with Dr. Parker.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the conveners of this wonderful conference with Yonsei University. Thank you, Dr. Sung Akalin, for this kind invitation. And I'm just looking forward to the conversation. Now, I am presenting to you the ideas of developing democratic womanism across global borders. Developing democratic womanism across global borders. And I'm sorry, I was starting my timer. Okay, here we go. This work is still a thought process that is beginning to think about how many single women or widowed women with children across the globe are experiencing lack of money or finances, while also asking what are the bodily experiences, both from the children's standpoint and the mother's standpoint, when you realize that there may not be enough money or financial aid for food, for gas, for clothing, for an automobile to go to work, or even just food and shelter to survive in the day-to-day life. So what does it mean for women who keep pushing forward, even as we see caravans of people crossing multiple borders in order to get to a land that they hope will be able to sustain them? And then also knowing that once you get to that land that you hope will sustain you, may actually send you back to a place that if you return, you can easily be killed, your children be killed, just with trauma and traumatic events going on in that returning country. Now, while there are no easy answers to these questions, I do raise them in order to provide a bit of context for constructing and developing democratic womanism across global borders. And this text, this idea, is coming from readings in the Gospel of Luke, in addition to a poem offered by Alice Walker in 2012 entitled Democratic Womanism. In that poem, Walker recites this piece in a conversation with a group called Democracy Now!, wherein she engages womanism as a particular perspective to engage the experiences of women of color regarding issues around reproductive health, reproductive rights, economic issues, specifically pertaining to women. And Walker understands democratic womanism as a way of life that honors the feminine, a way that acknowledges the theft of the wisdom female. So remember, acknowledging the feminine and acknowledging the theft of the wisdom female. In essence, Alice Walker is asking, how can a dark mother leadership be allowed to fly this spaceship of Earth? And I know it's interesting language, but what she's lifting up is the idea that women from dark continents, so to speak, Black and brown women, have never been tapped to engage in global leadership roles that can actually right some of the wrongs that global leaders have allowed to occur on our planet. So that is what Alice Walker in Democratic Womanism is beginning to argue for. But note, even with the idea of democratic womanism, man is still right there in the middle. So democratic womanism is not an idea that dismisses men or tries to get rid of men, but just trying to allow women's leadership to become impactful on the world scale. And so, as I was thinking about Alice Walker's democratic womanism, I was beginning to think about areas in the biblical text, specifically the New Testament, where women have been shown to provide leadership in areas that we least expect. And so the text of Luke chapter 8, 1-3 came to my mind as a conversation partner with the idea of democratic womanism. And in order to get to Luke, I have to do a few things. I want to talk about women's economic issues in the context of the United States, in the context of the globe, and then begin to have conversations between those contexts and the ways that womanists have already begun to read the Gospel of Luke in particular economic ways and through particular womanist economic hermeneutics. So, as I'm moving to a subsection entitled Understanding Women and Economics. Now, according to the Center for American Progress, in the context of the United States, white mothers make up the majority of breadwinning and co-breadwinning mothers due to their overall greater numbers. However, when analyzing the data within racial and ethnic groups, it becomes clear that white women are less likely to be breadwinners than women of color. Black mothers are by far the most likely to be the primary source of economic support for their families. They are also more than twice as likely as white mothers to be their family's breadwinner, and more than 50% more likely than Hispanic mothers. White women, by contrast, are the most likely to be co-breadwinning wives, although the differences across racial and ethnic groups are not as large as those for breadwinning mothers. So that's the context of the United States. Then I began to ask, what does the context of the globe begin to show us? And the ways that I began to research that included looking at the UN report on women, so the United Nations report on women. And when women work, the United Nations offered, economies grow. So now we're thinking globally. An increase in female labor force participation or a reduction in the gap between women and men's labor force participation results in faster economic growth. Secondly, there is evidence from a range of countries that shows an increase in the share of household income controlled by women changes spending in ways that benefit both children and communities. Third, the United Nations shows that women tend to have less access to formal financial institutions and saving mechanisms. So 50% of men report having a bank account at a formal financial institution, while only 40% of women do so worldwide. And so this gap is even larger among lower middle income economies, as well as in South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. So again, what does it mean to begin to think about expanding women's access to financial institutions? Fifth, the United Nations describes women's economic equality as being good for business. Companies greatly benefit from increasing leadership opportunities for women, which is shown to increase organizational effectiveness. So it's estimated that companies with 3 or more women in senior management functions score higher in all dimensions of organizational effectiveness. So there's even more information that the United Nations Global Account for Women begins to show, but I am going to move on a little bit in order to get to the biblical part that begins to merge these conversations. So, as a womanist biblical scholar, I already have certain tools in my hermeneutical bag in order to begin to read text and nuance my readings of text in conversation with women's lived experiences. And so I would argue that the first thing that's always important for me is to begin to look at women's issues in the biblical text and begin to see how scholars of more traditional identities begin to read and interpret the women. And so as a womanist biblical scholar, I argue that my interest in women and the economy, the global economy, fares well with conversations with women in the biblical narrative who hear the teachings of Jesus and even contribute to his ministry as identified in Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3 specifically. And then the other aspect of this is that engaging the current cultural moment of the COVID-19 global pandemic, this global phenomenon, I'm beginning to interrogate the connection between economics, women, and also health and trauma as we look at this Luke 8, 2 through 3 passage. And thinking about the context of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, it seems to me that if Luke is writing to an elite auditor, or an elite patron, someone who is bankrolling Luke in his own aspect to write this particular gospel, then perhaps it becomes even more important to think about Luke 8, 2 through 3 in relationship to economics, because Luke's gospel may be being bankrolled by Theophilus as he understands Theophilus in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. But with all of that said, I want to look at womanists who engage Luke and begin to engage the issues of economics, politics, and trauma as they engage Luke. One such scholar is Stephanie Buchanan Crowder. Stephanie Buchanan Crowder writes on the Gospel of Luke for the commentary entitled True to Our Native Land. And as she goes through the entirety of the Gospel of Luke, Crowder's work deftly intersperses African-American storytelling and history with Luke's gospel. So she opens up the commentary suggesting that just as African-American faith is connected to political, social, and economic enhancement, she notes that Luke's gospel shares similar concerns. And so I would argue that we can begin to have conversations about the Gospel of Luke, not just related to African-American faith that's connected to political, social, and economic enhancement, but what it looks like to think about global issues of political, social, and economic enhancement. And then another womanist scholar who engages the Gospel of Luke is Mitzi Smith. In her work, I Found God in Me, her anthology, now her edited volume, Smith observes a soteriological hermeneutical circle that's operating in the Gospel of Luke, specifically looking at crowds. And in her work regarding crowds, I was seeing the connection between the caravans that I began to introduce in the beginning of this essay and what it means for salvation, not that individualistic salvation, but more of a political, global healing of women's economic issues as they find themselves in these massive crowds that Mitzi Smith interrogates in the Gospel of Luke. And then thirdly, Bridget Green highlights the work of Fannie Lou Hamer to argue that when Hamer says, nobody's free until everybody's free, that motto serves as a major political slogan for the freedom movements of the 1970s. But what does it mean to begin to think about that freedom movement for a global community of women? And I think that these three womanist New Testament scholars who are engaging the Gospel of Luke can be a starting point to think about how we do democratic womanism across the globe, where women are actually lifted up and doing global leadership that benefits women, just as the UN has proffered in some of its work. So my point is that womanists are engaging and promoting economic, soteriological, and political liberation in their readings. So how can I begin to impact these already developed readings that includes global economics? And so that means I then have to turn to some critical theoretical work, specifically looking at liberalism and neoliberal economies in order to begin to think globally about this development. Looking at the work of Carrie Day, I would argue that a womanist hermeneutic must engage the cultural intricacies of neoliberal ideas of market economics in order to build a womanist hermeneutic of the economy that can move into the global ramifications of democratic womanism. So what Carrie Day does, and in this section, I'm moving to Carrie Day's work that resists neoliberal market economics. The idea of resisting neoliberal market economics means that Black women and brown women across the globe are disproportionately experiencing the impact of exploitative processes more frequently as a result of neoliberal market practices around the world. So you can think about sweatshops around the world. You can think about the backlash of failed economic policies in different parts of the globe that have been colonized by Eurocentric nations and markets. So Day argues that a neo-Marxist, neoliberalism has meant a free market system that privileges economic redistribution to the wealthy. Such social economic systems have been characterized by structural adjustment policies created by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which is that organization of 190 countries that work to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth while reducing poverty around the world. Yes, that's what they say they're going to do. But what we found is that neoliberalism in this market process is a type of rationality that actually keeps certain people who are on the underside in that same part of the underside, actually reducing their human subjectivities. So Carrie Day's work, coupled with Mitzi Smith, Bridget Green, and Stephanie Buchanan Crowder, helped me begin to think about reading the Gospel of Luke in such a way that I engage the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna in Luke chapter 8, 2-3, and how they are known for providing ministry to the Jesus journey in Luke chapter 8. But what's important for these three women, as I read them thinking about economics and trauma and the idea of movement, is that these women come from different backgrounds. Mary Magdalene, what I've discovered in my research is that not a lot of scholars think about where she came from. Magdala was one of those places that had seen and undergone a lot of trauma as it was resisting the Emperor Vespasian regarding his own takeover of parts of that city that she's known for. And so Mary Magdalene is important because she experienced trauma in her hometown. Now, Joanna is important because she's married to a rich man, supposedly, perhaps. That's what most scholars believe. And because she is also well known in the Lucan community, she's providing funds that perhaps Mary Magdalene or perhaps Susanna do not have. And so what does it look like to begin to think through how various women from different parts of different areas of society can actually come together and begin to be a force to be reckoned with that builds democratic womanism across the borders? Mary Magdalene knows trauma. Joanna is a woman of means. The third woman, Susanna, is not well known in the context of Luke 8, 2-3. That means that we need entities across the globe who bring together different witnesses, various financial resources, along with members of the subaltern together. Now I'm thinking through Gayatri Spivak, in order to bring together these different experiences that bring intellectual experiences, that bring financial resources, and that even bring and listen to traumatic experiences in order to provide not resources for a group of men like Jesus and the disciples, but instead of praising the women in Luke 8, 2-3 for providing resources to Jesus and the disciples, what would it look like for women to pool their resources for other women across a larger global scale? If we could have the capacity to build resources, economic, traumatic storytelling, becoming true neighbors with one another globally, bridging these resources across the globe, that, my friends, is what I would say is the beginning of developing democratic womanism. Thank you. And there was a lot more, but I appreciate the time to begin to unpack some of these thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parker. At this point, we aren't going to have questions unless there's a question of clarification, something that you didn't understand that you want Dr. Parker to clarify as we move through the conversation. If there is, please type that in the chat box so that I know that that question is there. Otherwise, assuming that there is not, I will remind everyone that there will be a half an hour for questions at the end. So you can type your questions for Dr. Parker into the chat box now while they are fresh, or you can keep them in your notes and you can raise them as we move through the conversation. Dr. Parker, this question about what you mean by democracy, is that something you can clarify for us briefly?
Yes, I'm thinking about the idea of women's leadership in political capacities across the globe. So even thinking about folks like Angela Merkel in Germany and what it looks like to actually actively think about women being a part of democratic, of systems of government where they are embodying leadership roles. That's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much. And so those of you that have deeper questions, that hopefully that will help to spur some things, and you can put your questions in the chat box at any time. At this point, we will move to our second presenter, who is Dr. Adam Braun. And Dr. Braun, I forgot to tell Dr. Parker this, but I will give you a 5-minute timing in the private chat, and I'll count down for you from there, unless you want 10 minutes earlier.
No, that's fine. 5 minutes is fine.
Okay, wonderful.
All right. That was a fantastic presentation just before. I hope that I can follow it up with something substantial. Thank you to Yonsei University for hosting this, and for my co-presenters, Professor Yoon and Professor Parker and Professor Allen. It's always an honor to be the only male on a panel, so for that I'm also grateful. Yes, so we're going to look at race and legitimacy in Acts 17, an approach from political theology. Again, Acts 17:26 says, "From one person God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their lands." So I'm going to trace a bit the reception of this text. When one encounters a text like Acts 17:26, it is possible now to consider the problems and violences caused by its receptions, in particular, in respect to Dr. Parker's presentation, liberalism and neoliberalism, how this gets received there. But I want to kind of situate myself in a trajectory before I talk about my methodology. I am kind of inspired with Dr. Gaffney's work on Black Lives Matter hermeneutics, where she says there is a significant difference now in how I teach after the emergence of the BLM movement I'm more intentional in talking about whiteness and white supremacist culture and ideology and the roles of these elements in the founding and shaping of the West, of America, of public and private institutions, including those which knowledge is constructed and passed on, and of the church and its institutions. So taking that as a starting position, let me briefly consider the text of Acts as a text and look ahead to the consequences of its theologization. From the likely subjugated social position of the diasporic text, every human nation refers to both the dominating nations and the subjugated nations. In its negative function, it rejects the sovereignty of the imperialists and invites solidarity among other ethnoi, other nations. As a text, prior to its theologization, it produces no universalizing category of the human. Yet the theologization and scripturalization of the text now legitimates the possibility of a universal category of human, which is taken up by Enlightenment liberals. Both Frederick Douglass and the authors of the Anti-Slavery Manual rely on a political theology of the universal human that suggests the possibility of the equality of races. Unfortunately, it also functions to mask the political theology of race, which relies on this masking to perpetuate its ideologies. Let me explain and then demonstrate how race still functions as a political theology in contemporary discourses on race. I'm going to go through a methodology and then look at Tim Keller's recent intervention against political conservative white supremacists, but also, and this happened as I was preparing, Professor Wong-Gi Park published Multiracial Biblical Studies. I kind of want to trace a line through that, which was just published last week. All right, so following yesterday, Dr. Kotsko's definition of political theology in his work, Neoliberalism's Demons, he states that political theology as a discipline is something that rejects the religious and secular binary. So then if we're going to put race then as a political theology, we're not talking about race as a biological category, it never has been, but the way in which racial politics have been theologized and racialized theologies have made its way into politics, or specifically the way white supremacy as the primary racialized theology has shaped the global world and the means of production. Kotsko continues, it is this world ordering ambition of theology which relies on people's convictions about how the world is and ought to be, that for me represents a more fruitful distinction between theological discourse and philosophical or scientific discourses, at least as the latter tend to be practiced in the contemporary world. Thus, analyzing theology as a discourse can illuminate the way the world is being made, and sometimes, as with liberal theologies of race, mask the way an important world, mask the important way the world is being made. Okay. On the most fundamental level, he continues, I regard political theology as a study of systems of legitimacy of the way that political, social, economic, and religious orders maintain their explanatory power and justify the loyalty of their adherents. So race is something that is self-legitimizing and also is something that makes the world the way it is. So in this paper, here we go, I want to consider that race is its own self-legitimating order, born in the throes of modernity, colonialism, and early globalization. Rather than naming the cultural similarities of those with similar skin, race subtly, through politics and theology, names a way that the world is being made and remade. Specifically, it names the structure of the global means of production of at least, but not only, Western commodities through the exploitation of Black folk in the US and abroad, as well as other non-white folk, relying on the structures left in place by Western colonization. One might ask about Asian folk or Latinx folk. Is Asian a race? Is Latinx a race? The ambiguity in defining race, in answering these questions, demonstrates the way race functions as a political theology, even in the liberal theologies of the early abolitionists. The indeterminacy of the question of race masks its function in the real world, which is at least to make Black subservient to white, especially in relation to the value of labor. In short, there is no possibility for the equality of races because race is a racist category, bearing within it already the tools of white supremacy. The indeterminability to answer the question, what is race actually, functions to legitimate the racial hierarchy embedded in all racial categorizations. Equality, if possible, must be sought beyond the limits of race. So just to look at a few examples, Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." I don't think he is necessarily using this as a political theology, but he is calling out white people for not adhering to their own political theology. So he says, you can bear in your bosom the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the Black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all the nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. There we get Acts 17:26, and have commanded all men everywhere to love one another, yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own. I have a footnote down there to look more into Douglass's political theology, where he says that which is inhuman cannot be divine, almost as if his anthropology takes precedence, which is a really fascinating move, but for another day. And then in John Fee's anti-slavery manual, he also takes up the Act 17. Some persons in our country claim the right to enslave the colored man or Negro on the assumption that he is a different race of beings from the white man and was made to be enslaved. Such persons take the position of the infidel and denying the Bible, which teaches us that God hath made of one blood all nations of men. So what I'm trying to demonstrate, what's happening here, is that in arguing for the equality of all men, they are in fact perpetuating the category of race, which continues underneath it all to keep the hierarchies in place. So good intentions, but perhaps a bad outcome, right? Always consider the impact before outcome. So because of time, we're going to skip ahead a bit. Tim Keller, he writes on the Gospel Coalition. He is what I call a famous conservative posing as a centrist Christian. And he has written a number of blogs. This one after Charlottesville, he says, this is a time to present the Bible's strong and clear teachings about the sin of racism and of the idolatry of blood and country. Again, full stop. In Acts 17:26, there we see it again, in the midst of an evangelistic lecture to secular pagan philosophers, Paul makes the case that God created all the races from one man. Paul's Greek listeners saw other races as barbarian, but against such views of racial superiority, Paul makes the case that all races have the same creator and are of one stock. Since all are made in God's image, every human life is of infinite and equal value. When Jonah put the national interests of Israel ahead to the spiritual good of the racially other pagan city of Nineveh, he is roundly condemned by God. I won't finish, but so first of all, the Bible is not strong or clear on racism because there is little evidence that race, as we know it now, existed as a category in the biblical world. Consider, again, Gaffney when she says, while racism does not exist in the Hebrew scriptures, there is vicious ethnic conflict that can function as an analog for contemporary race-based conflict. This is true, but as mentioned above, Keller's reading of the scripture legitimates and indeed crystallizes race as an essential category of the universal human. In other words, all races have the same creator, presents race, which we know to be a social construct, as a political theology that legitimates the racialization of the world. It should come as no surprise then when in his later treatises, he's published 4 articles in 2020 all together, really long, he criticizes critical race theory without citing any academic critical race theorists and Marxist interpretations of race and names them unchristian. Keller's arguments amount to one of 2 very white Christian strategies. Number 1, Jesus saved us, so why can't we all just get along? If we could only behave like Jesus, then all races could be equal. At times, Keller exhibits the second strategy of pessimism. Humans are depraved and races will never be able to get along. This strategy, without any historization of the category of race, functions to relieve himself and white people of a very recent problem that they created. All right. I want to also take up Professor Wongi Park's multiracial biblical studies because I think it's very recent and I think it's very good, but I still think it keeps that category of race intact. And what I'm arguing is that race is a political theology that will legitimate how the world is being made, and keeping that intact still keeps the problems persisting. So Park's excellent article offers already important solutions to the problem of racism in biblical studies. In fact, I believe his suggestions should be implemented. However, I believe his categorization of multiracial still keeps in place race as a political theology that shapes the world. So notably, he comes out and says clearly that to define whiteness solely and exclusively in relation to biological markers, which in and of themselves have no meaning, runs the risk of perpetuating the modern myth of race. To be crystal clear, race is a social construct and has no physical, genetic, or biological basis in human blood and DNA. Okay, but yet, when he designates the opposition of whiteness, he says, I appeal to multiracial coalitions of Africana, Asian, Indigenous, Islander, Latinx, and white scholars across racial / ethnic, you see the slippage there, generational and geographical lines who have laid the foundation for this work. So let us note the slippage of the racial / ethnic, and the solution has been positioned as multiracial biblical studies. This is the same slippage or uncommitting interrogation found in the Samea volume. They were all together in one place toward a minority biblical criticism. They always use the race / ethnicity. Some of this slippage can be due to Denise Buell's work and Eric Barretto's work on race. I don't have time to go into that. But this slippage also masks the reality of race under capitalism, the social location from which nearly all of us are doing scholarship. Moreover, and now I address a little bit of the Korean context, just as an example, and because this is being presented in Korean. Doing biblical studies from a Korean context, for example, simply does not protect biblical studies from the reproduction of Eurocentrism, whiteness, and the citation of white sources. John Ahn, in his edited volume, Landscapes of Korean and Korean American Interpretation, he struggles with this reality. He says, in my view, this is the hallmark of Korean and Korean American biblical interpretation, not communicative action from Habermas, but communication and reproduction of scholarship, a synthesis of information gathered from our mentors or Dr. Vatur and institutions, reproducing and passing down a stock of knowledge. And beyond this reality in scholarship, many of those other identities listed in Park's coalition still perpetuate anti-Blackness and benefit from the exploitation of Black peoples everywhere. Until that is addressed, the violent effects of racism will continue to persist. Put another way, A multiracial coalition cannot defeat racism and only keeps the political theology of race and its legitimacy intact. Only solidarity with and the lifting up of Black folk can ultimately undo whiteness. So I'll conclude really quickly. I have demonstrated, I think, the prevalence of race as a political theology and its world-making functions. The response, if one hopes to counter white supremacy, is the delegitimization of race. The abolition of race as a category of the human from the face of the earth. This will require all within the anti-white supremacist coalition to center and privilege Black voices, which will result, as Acts 17 suggests, a turning upside down of the world. For biblical studies, then, this will require at least taking up the suggestion of Vincent Wimbush from more than 20 years ago. What might happen if the African Americans were to become the starting point for the academic study of the Bible? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Braun. Does anybody have any clarifying questions for Dr. Braun before we move to our final presenter? Dr. Braun, can you clarify the distinction between intersectional and multiracial biblical interpretation?
I mean, maybe in a longer conversation, but just really quickly, multiracial is the category that Dr. Park used in his article that came out last week, and that does not include, say, gender or ability or class. Intersectional would be an analysis that includes various forms of exclusion under any hegemonic system.
Thank you. Then let us continue with our final presenter, Dr. Isil Yoon from Yonsei University.
Okay, hello everyone. It's a huge honor to be one of the presenters today, and I deeply appreciate all of the moderators, the organizer, Dr. Lim, Dr. Parker, and the wonderful thought-provoking presenters. Thank you so much for your papers. And the audience, all of the audience as well. So please let me share screen my PowerPoint. Okay, the title of my paper is Imago Dei and Human Dignity, Restoring Democracy in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. So the so-called digital revolution has been progressing with increasingly smarter versions of artificial intelligence, and the continual advancement of technology has been contributing to growing automation and further development of machines. Nevertheless, whether smarter technology will lead to wiser individuals and a better world is questionable, as critical side effects and damage caused by technological enhancements have been increasing in modernity. And in this paper, I will focus on three major democratic values: transparency, democracy, equality, and freedom that have been challenged in the age of artificial intelligence due to the misuse of technology. I'll also examine the contribution of the theological concept of Imago Dei in restoring democracy, and I'll particularly explore how the modern Catholic social teaching tradition's understanding of Imago Dei, with its emphasis on solidarity and the common good, can critique social structures that deny human dignity and human rights of those who have experienced damage. Its ontological as well as practical values can contribute to establishing a society where vulnerable populations become active social participants through restored democratic values. First off, artificial intelligence is intelligence manifested by machines, especially computer systems that aims to simulate the cognitive intelligence of a human being. So as computers began to perform more complex tasks throughout history after the time of the Second World War, there were early hopes for so-called technology-driven wave of democratization due to the rapidly increased convenience and connectivity. Nevertheless, this early belief or desire began to be challenged as individuals, civil rights organizations, and broader society gradually noticed negative impacts of technological advancements. To be specific, democratic processes have been hindered in the way information is created and distributed through enhanced technology. So three major democratic values that have been hampered are transparency, equality, and freedom. So these are distinctive but closely connected. The dilution of such values is observed in various sectors of life, including companies and government politics, criminal justice, and employment. These are the sectors I would like to focus on. First, democracy has been damaged by the abuse of technological enhancements due to companies and governments' manipulation of information on social media that controls individuals' thoughts. Transparency has been lacking when either companies or governments provide information as they regulate the data and ideas that are spread online. And companies employ certain words, emphasize certain ideas, and disguise others as a way to obtain more desirable results. And this information can impact the thoughts and decisions of social media users. So it can be said that those concerned with the governance of technology engage in nudging on a larger scale, which becomes the modern form of paternalism conducted either by companies or governments. In case of companies, they can order, generate, and spread content about the products and services that enable them to obtain more profitable outcomes. The lack of proper transparency and democratic governance can be aggravated by the ever-increasing competition among markets in the age of AI and consequent socioeconomic problems of dominance and polarization. In promoting the vision of continual technological enhancements and further superintelligence, the ideology of laissez-faire capitalism and neoliberalism is deeply rooted. With the pursuit of profits, the age of AI is based on a free market economy with ongoing stimulation of competition. In the process, as technological developments require a lot of money, companies need wealthy investors to provide capital. They require a greater price for their innovations in order to further acquire and create commodities. The consequence of this is the control of market power and communication routes by a small number of technology elites, which can further magnify disinformation with their imbalance of socioeconomic and political influence, and with increased competition to draw users' attention. In addition to private companies, governments can also exercise control by massively distributing or rather hiding particular political ideas. For instance, during elections, voters can be manipulated to encounter specific information about or the ideas of a certain candidate supported by the government. I'm talking about one possibility. And such a process can either enhance popularity or defame a candidate, depending on what is shown and in what manner. As a consequence of this, citizens and undecided voters in particular can be impacted in their decision-making. The entire operation of disinformation leads to society members being deprived of freedom, whether they're conscious or unconscious of this. They lose the opportunity to participate in the democratic process of searching for information in accordance with their interests and needs, deciding on their own, and having access to the source and origin of information they're offered. They lose agency in individual decision making, like furthering restricts their socioeconomic and political participation. Another sector where the delusion of transparency, equality, and freedom happens is in criminal justice, which deals with identifying and punishing perpetrators of crimes. Criminal justice is an area where democracy is hampered, particularly through the discrimination and exclusion of socially marginalized populations. Although computer programs are expected to be neutral and unbiased, the non-transparent nature of information providers and the manipulation of data enables a skewed data analysis, which leads to discrimination in the administrative decision-making processes based on the analysis. An example can be seen in the distortion that's involved in predictive policing. As a strategy used in various law enforcement practices, predictive policing refers to the application of analytical techniques to identify likely targets for police intervention and prevent crime or solve past crimes by making statistical predictions. It has been employed mostly in the United States, but also elsewhere throughout the world. And computer programs have been installed to detect predictive crimes, so-called, for data collection, particularly in places where significant activity or danger occurs. The data analysis and police operations are then based on this information. Although predictive policing is oriented toward problem solving with deterrent intentions, it can endanger abusive police practices with biased data analysis. A plethora of research has reported that neutrality and accuracy are lacking in the process, as socially disadvantaged people groups are targeted disproportionately. Algorithms can show regions of high crime risk from data about crime history, information collected by CCTV, profiles collected by social media, or mortgage defaults, and so on. This means that data acquired by an algorithm unavoidably shows the social context where they are produced. And it is inevitable that police searches will repeat in the same neighborhoods or regions, leading to over-policing and more incarcerations. In other words, predictive policing punishes people based on their social context, like poverty, the lower class, like people of color, etc. So it renders them susceptible to discrimination, the first to be detected and more likely to receive higher punishment. As a result, artificial intelligence can harm the value of equality by violating the right to equal protection of the law. Moreover, socially powerless people are deprived of freedom from discrimination both in the criminal law and the operation of criminal justice. The mainstream justice system becomes a means to exclude socially powerless people. The high degree of punishment against the marginalized can reinforce negative stereotypes of people in particular social context, and this can become a barrier to their socioeconomic and political activities. It can lead to the disruption of social justice and democracy. And finally, democratic values can be deprived also in socioeconomic sectors through the rapid increase of so-called technological unemployment. Technological unemployment refers to a reduction of the workforce due to technological development and machines' consequent replacement of human labor. The groups whose tasks will be impacted to a larger degree are those in the lower and middle classes. And the jobs of those in the lower class that are relatively more manual, simple, and repetitive are more likely to be replaced by machines on a faster rate. In addition, the middle class will experience job losses in the future as technological advancements expand through professions previously considered safe from this impact. This may lead to the employees having concern for their survival even more basic than their concern for political participation, such as in elections. While they may find a short-term job that's low wage in the marginalized industry, they will continue to be in the precarious socioeconomic state. As a consequence, ever-increasing AI-facilitated automation can cause the problem of social inequality and the loss of freedom. It first leads to social inequality as machines' replacement of labor brings about polarization between jobs, along with the job losses in certain groups. More job opportunities will be given to those who have suitable technical skills and those who are sufficiently wealthy to access continual training opportunities. And the beneficiaries will most likely be socially privileged people in more developed countries. And it further reinforces social polarization as well. And given this, I will explore how the theological concept of Imago Dei can become an effective tool to repair the social harms described above and restore democracy in the digital age. Imago Dei, the Latin phrase for image of God, is the biblical concept or doctrine that denotes the nature and purpose of mankind, as well as its relationship with God. So, like all of you guys may know, Genesis 1:27 indicates its essence, stating that God created man in his own image, meaning that a particular likeness to God has been granted to humanity. And Imago Dei is the primary theological foundation of human dignity that grounds on inherent or universal value that cannot be denied. In Christian theology, such value is stressed as God is proclaimed to be the source and object of human existence and human purposes. The dignity of all persons is claimed by God, and it exists in their ability, which emerges from the empowerment of Christ's grace to recognize and respond to this claim. So human dignity necessitates not only the obligations of an individual to God as well as to other creatures, but also the limitations of others' claims upon the individual. Among a wide variety of traditions, modern Catholic social thought that developed particularly in the 19th century provides teachings on dignity, particularly with regard to its implications in promoting social justice and peace. It places a special emphasis on protecting the powerless in society, arguing that this is grounded in the very nature of God, as well as God's mandate for humans. In Catholic social thought, the message of dignity goes beyond the individual level, becoming the grounding of moral solidarity. The human worth denoted in Imago Dei signifies that every human person is equally valuable, that is, equally worthy of respect and consideration. The worth that everyone possesses indicates the fundamental relationality and community present in all persons. It further stresses the rightful attitude that humans should take towards each other, namely to cherish our relationships with others in solidarity and mutual love. With absolute value, no one's dignity is to be unjustly violated, regardless of the person's social context. Like, all humans have the responsibility to devote themselves in solidarity to defending those whose dignity is denied, and to strive for social harmony and peace where everyone is respected and lives in well-being. And the implications of dignity regarding relationality and solidarity becomes the foundation of human rights. So these are a set of basic claims or entitlements along with duties that are correlative to the rights. So in order for everyone to be respected and to exercise agency, all individuals, without exception, need to be guaranteed human rights that'll ensure their freedom and basic standards living. And the rights impose negative duties, namely duties of non-interference that'll guarantee freedom, along with positive duties that are related to the active provision of protection and assistance. The performance of such duties on the part of individual neighbors, as well as wider society as a whole, bear a special responsibility for this commitment through the juridical implementation of comprehensive sets of rights and duties. In Catholic social thought, the implementation of rights and duties on a global level and the consequent guarantee of all individuals' well-being is a social aim of chief importance. The Pope John XXIII particularly emphasized that that is the only way the common good can be achieved. The common good, the good for all, is defined as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So it is the aim of the good life with and for others in just institutions, so necessitating the establishment of social conditions where each individual can flourish. And in promoting the good for all, safeguarding socially vulnerable people becomes a necessary component and one where solidarity should be exercised. And a very important concept here can be the preferential option for the poor, or the option or law of preference for the poor. So although normally, like secularly, preference has negative connotations, but in the Catholic tradition, it means prioritizing those in need. So when their basic rights are denied, like including the rights to food, like shelter, and social participation, and when their well-being is in serious danger, like providing them special protection should be justified. And it is a social duty to help them restore their entitlement for equal respect as agents in society. So the assistance they require includes offering basic necessities, as well as establishing social conditions that ensure their socioeconomic and political rights. So this is the mandate that's derived from all humans' universal and absolute value that Imago Dei denotes. So the modern Catholic social tradition's teaching on Imago Dei regarding human dignity can play a crucial role in critiquing the exclusion and further marginalization of socially vulnerable groups in the age of AI, and in suggesting directions needed to restore democracy. First and foremost, it can address the loss of democratic values as a fundamental denial of socially powerless people's inherent worth and consequently the human rights they possess. The non-transparency present in surveillance, disinformation, and inspection on social media, in the criminal justice system, and at the workplace becomes an affront to the human dignity of each society member by hindering their freedom and equality. So as individuals are manipulated by technology, like technology providers to be exact, they are fundamentally deprived of the right to personal liberty. And social media users, manipulated either by private company or governments, lose the opportunity to form ideas and think and behave according to their interests and needs. In addition, people who are excluded and marginalized in criminal justice systems and employment not only lose freedom before the law and in socioeconomic activities, but they are violated their right to equality, non-discrimination, and just treatment. So the exclusion that occurs due to their social context further restricts their social participation and integration. In this context, Imago Dei can provide an essential justification that all individuals, as the image of God and with the unconditional value they have, should receive respectful treatment than being controlled in the age of technological advancements. So it asserts that everyone should have agency in their social, political, and economic life. And furthermore, it can Imago Dei can condemn the social structures that not only cause but facilitate such damage. It definitely indicates that that's social sin or structural or systemic evil, and it can it addresses the reality that fails to practice negative and positive duties, both the duties of non-interference and active support. And finally, it can call for the establishment and actualization of juridical policies in the digital age that contribute to restoring democracy in a way that guarantees human rights protections and well-being of everyone and prioritizes the needs of the socially marginalized. So that's in order to denounce oppressive social structures and to announce substitutive structures that can repair false injustices. So I'll wrap up real quickly. And it also necessitates some concrete laws and social policies in a way that respects all users of technology as they are and redress social division and provide equal opportunities. And decentralization of the power will be the key in the process. And the laws and policies should uphold the diversity of everyone rather than promote discrimination. And also, it should provide education and training opportunities to everyone so that they can have more employment opportunities. And universal basic income, UBI, will be one possibility. Like, although to exactly whom and to what range it should be provided will be at the center of debate as well. And next up is my conclusion that technology is a gift of God if used in a wise way, where humans' great potential can be exercised, though it can be a disaster otherwise. And the rest was the repetition, the contribution that imago Dei, the connotations of imago Dei can make in the age of digital age. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to a rich conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoon, and to all of our presenters. Can we have all of the presenters on the screen again as we move into this discussion time? I know there are some questions for all of the presenters already beginning to show in the chat box, and that is fabulous. Are there any clarifying questions for Dr. Yoon before we move into that piece of the conversation? I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege and ask the first question, also to hopefully encourage those of you who haven't had the chance to put your questions in the chat box. And then we'll move forward. And my question is actually for both Dr. Yoon and Dr. Parker. I imagine you probably saw some correlations in your own presentations, although you're talking about very different kinds of technology, the writing of Luke's gospel versus artificial intelligence in the computer age. But you both named the ways in which wealthy benefactors can begin to influence and shift the message as it's being presented. And I just wonder if you could speak to how you see that maybe the similarities or differences, or what can be learned from one context to the other.
You want to go ahead first, Dr. Yoon?
Yeah, I deeply appreciate your insights, Dr. Parker, as well. And I certainly noticed the similarity between our arguments. And I actually had a question, like, plus an insight as well. And I really agree that like your argument implied the importance of decentralization and resistance to neoliberalism, which I definitely agree with. On the other hand, I thought, like, in my argument, I kind of already assumed that capitalism and neoliberalism is hard to resist, and it's in the progress, and it's going to continue to progress in the future. And so rather than completely resisting it, kind of creating an environment where democracy can be exercised within the context of capitalism and neoliberalism, I thought it's not all that impossible, although it's really, really challenging. And I thought the fact that it's super challenging is why you highly emphasize resistance of the neoliberalism. We've already seen in history that kind of pursuing democratic like neoliberalism is almost like impossible, and then I thought why resisting it, it's almost really important. But I also thought about the unrealistic like reality of that, unrealistic like aspect of that, which is why I kind of thought about ways to reduce like the negative impacts within the boundary of neoliberalism. So I was wondering how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's both Dr. Allen and Dr. Yoon, you're prompting some of my conversation and some of my thoughts on how we can allow, or at least persuade, or at least force in some way. And I hate to use the language of force, but there has to be a way that those who are on the upper sides of capitalism, where that 1% of money and capital across the globe is concentrated, there has to be a way to shift some of those financial resources to folks who we see even in refugee camps across the globe, because I noticed that there was one question about refugee camps and how we begin to think about that. And I think that there's this idea of, if we had to go there, women who have billions of dollars. I'm thinking Oprah. I don't know why I'm looking at Oprah, but what it looks like to think about these women who actually can have some resources in order to make some changes in the world. Because I agree, I don't think capitalism is going anywhere. And I also think that neoliberalism still needs to be resisted, even as we think about how we reframe what we do with all these large amounts of money that's not getting to the people who actually need it. So even with refugee camps, the people can't even like take out so much money per day from some of their financial institutions. We see that happening in Afghanistan as well, where people do not have access to finances in order to make any kind of changes. So I think it's almost like a double-edged sword. How do we get the money, but also how do we resist the ways that people who had access to all the money stop continuing to have all the access to all the money? So it is like a both and for me as well.
Yeah, and thank you. And I forgot to tell you what I learned from your point as well. And like you said, like in this kind of situation, there are certain groups of people who can really exercise leadership and like unexpected power, including colored people and women, like you said. So yeah, it's the upside down phenomenon. So I really appreciate that point. And people who have been considered as like marginalized or powerless, they can actually exercise like even higher power. So I really appreciate that point. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I also think that with Dr. Braun's work, the neoliberalism aspect is coming through for all of us on how we resist neoliberalism and think differently about the ways that we're doing this type of scholarship. So I think I'd like to hear about how we're all thinking through resisting, but also realizing that we're working within neoliberal and capitalistic conversations.
Well, Dr. Braun, that's a question directed to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think first, in terms of the impossibility of resistance under capitalism, I'm reminded of the quote by the science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, who said, at some point, the divine right of kings was thought it would never go away. That we would only believe that the kings were ordained by God, and that's just the way that the world works. And then now we don't have kings anymore.
Right.
And yeah, I think, and she said, well, capitalism is the same way, right? The only thing, it limits our ability to imagine something else. That's one of the things that capitalism does anyways. But I also think if we're doing this work from a theological perspective, if you ask me what's more impossible, resurrection on the third day or the end of capitalism, I mean, those are both definitely hard to fathom, but I think you understand. We need to imagine. We need to imagine the possibility of justice that seems to us impossible in this moment.
Right, right.
Pairing that imagination with Dr. Parker's call to, and note that you're all resisting the neoliberal forces, even as we're struggling to live within them. The last question that's been put into the chat, well, that was up till a moment ago, the last question that was put into the chat directed to Dr. Braun. I actually want to expand and direct to all three of you to think about from your own contexts. And I'll read the question as it was written. Dr. Braun, while I appreciate your proposal to begin interpretations from African-American scholars, do you think that the idea of polyphony and multi-centeredness will be helpful to accept and celebrate differences that God created all people? And so to that question, I would take for Dr. Parker an interest in connecting that to how you've talked about the ways in which in these intersectional pooling of resources that's happened in the women in Luke. And to Dr. Yoon, this seems like it speaks directly into the application that you've talked about the Imago Dei, and I'd be interested to hear more about that as well. But Dr. Braun, maybe you can begin since the question was directed to you first.
I mean, in a short response to all three of those lines of questions there, I'm only talking about when we're analyzing race and when we're talking about racism. In those cases, we need to center Black voices, right? And so, of course, the idea of polyphony and multi-centeredness is crucial to doing all kinds of good work and justice around the world. However, I don't think we need to have necessarily a political theology of God creating all humans in order to treat each other with dignity. I don't think we need any kind of theology to actually do that. We should be able to look at the face of the other and say, okay, let's not kill each other. Let's not be horrible to each other. I don't think we need a theology to justify our actions and behaviors to one another.
And Dr. Allen, can you rephrase the question again one time for me so I can gather my thoughts on it? And thank you, Dr. Braun, for that.
Absolutely. So the question to Dr. Braun was around polyphony and multi-centeredness. And my curiosity for you is how do those ideas of polyphony and multi-centeredness fit with what you were drawing out of Luke's text, where you talked about these three very different women pooling their resources together? And even maybe if you could speak to some of what you alluded to a little bit ago in your remarks about the need to, in that pooling, decenter those who have traditionally had control. So perhaps maybe imagining Joanna at taking a step back in that.
Right.
Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. Okay. It's hard. I think one thing that I've been struggling with is, even in the text and even in the conversations that we're having, there's still an unaddressed situation of even people above the women who are pooling their resources. And that question then leads me to think about, how do we almost behead the system that keeps the unchecked power in place in the first place? And so I think that the coalition and the solidarity that can come through these multi-centered identities, which when we look at these identities, we can see that they're very different, but coming together, there's that strength in that multi-centered identity that I think in some way has to speak to how you take down a system as well. And I think that's what I'm hoping for in the midst of these conversations, that we get enough gumption to take down capitalism, even as we try to work within it. Because if you just keep Jesus and the guys in place as the heads, then that's going to be a problem for the women who are still serving the heads all the time. So I'm still thinking about that. Oh, Professor Braun. Yeah, that would be some initial responses, but I think I'm still formulating how to do that. Because, I will say one thing. Power is not bad. It's the folks who are wielding it in these horrific ways that makes power bad. So what does it mean for women to take over power? And I think that's part of what I'm hoping for with democratic womanism, the idea that women can take over power, and that's not a bad thing.
And as Dr. Yoon gives her response, I'm going to already preview for you, Dr. Parker, the question that's coming next, which is, as you think about these women taking over power, there's been some very specific questions asked of you in the chat related to women in refugee camps, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all of those questions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts after Dr. Yoon speaks about how that connects to this larger conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you both, Dr. Braun and Parker. I would like to say amen to your responses. And likewise, I definitely agree. When we think about the meaning of Imago Dei, everyone has been created equally, but everyone at the same time, we all are created differently, right? With different race and ethnicity, personality, gifts, and so on. But the problem arises when people are unjustly discriminated because of the differences, right? Even when the differences should be respected, the diversity. So in the context of artificial intelligence, I mean, we all know that technology is advancing, convenience and connectivity. I mean, it's actually hampering diversity, and it's actually taking advantage of like the socially marginalized people's like differences and discriminate them. So I totally agree, Dr. Parker, that unless systemic changes happen, I mean, their well-being cannot be guaranteed. I mean, no matter how like individuals are like have higher awareness, I mean, without the structural changes, given that the technology is progressing like at this rate, I mean, it just transformation is impossible without the structural changes. So, and the subversion of power by different groups of people, I mean, it can exercise invaluable things. So I appreciate both of your points, like theological and also social political implications as well.
Thank you. And as Dr. Allen has posed these other questions to me, I'd like to pick up a little bit on what Dr. Braun put forth regarding race and multiracial biblical studies and what that looks like. And I think two things are coming to my mind. I am a survivor of domestic violence. And so I look at some of the questions about what it means to center my own agency and my own voice and my own even readings of biblical texts as an African-American scholar, according to some of my own personal life experiences. And so I'm all for providing a space that says women can band together and do amazing things that we never even thought we could do. But I'm also still very much aware of centering African-American voices. So I'm still not sure how I feel about going back to the Vincent Wimbush idea of everyone going back to thinking through African-American voices in the Biblical Studies project. And I see what you're saying, Dr. Braun, but I'm still unsure of that. Only because I'm still very much aware of a reversal. I don't want a reversal where it ends up African-American on top and like white biblical studies on the bottom. And I know that's not what you're saying, but that's what I'm still worried about. And I think the same thing comes when I talk about agency and solidarity among women, that there is power that can come through that solidarity where an abuser is not going to continue to abuse his spouse if there are 5 or 6 other women standing there with machetes ready to take him down. It's just not going to do it. That was a very bad image, but that's what I'm thinking about. And so there has to be a way that the agency, the subjectivity, the solidarity of women can come together for the good and the uplift of women without the complete reversal of saying all men are bad. And that's what I'm trying to just begin to think through as I look through some of these questions, and how to actually think about the idea of the Imago Dei, where it's not, men Imago Dei up here and women Imago Dei down here, but it's the equality thing as you're even thinking about artificial intelligence. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Yoon. So I think that the continuation of storytelling in the midst of all these traumas actually bridges solidarity across identities together, so that when someone like a Joanna who has more money hears the story of someone like a Mary Magdalene who has less money but has the traumatic stories, you can kind of do an ebb and flow of how the solidarity across these identities occur. And you can do then a targeted almost beheading of the power structures that keep certain people in diminished spaces. I don't know if that answered the question, but those are my thoughts right now, Dr. Allen.
If it didn't answer the question, you got me so interested in what you did say that I forgot the question. So I am aware that we are at the point of time where I soon need to relinquish the microphone to Dr. Lim for some concluding remarks, but I want to give just 30 seconds or a minute to Dr. Yoon and Dr. Braun, if there's anything you wanted to say to respond to what Dr. Parker has just said, because I think it really is, for me at least, a call to thinking about how we can engage these kinds of studies differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Please, Dr.
Okay.
Braun.
Okay. Yeah. Let me clarify one thing, and I have questions here, but we'll talk about that in a minute. To clarify the point about starting with African American biblical interpretation. Yesterday, Dr. Kotsko was asked about China, and in his talk on neoliberalism, he said, "Well, neoliberalism isn't the only bad thing. China's also doing other bad things." Right? And I'm aware that there are other bad things that happen in the world. My point is to take up when race is activated as a category, and when race is activated as a category around the Bible, then we start with African American voices, because purpose of race, I'm arguing, functions to establish white supremacy over Black folk in the first instance. Okay, if we're going to talk about gender or post-coloniality or ability, we would start in a different place. So I don't think we always start with African American biblical interpretation or Black radical thought, which is a lot of what I used here. But when we activate the category of race and the discourse around the Bible, I think that's where we start.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Parker?
Go ahead, Dr. Yoon. I have nothing else to say.
I've learned so much, and I was really impressed that, like, in very different contexts, very specifically different contexts, there are some penetrating points, like theological points, which kind of excited me. And like Dr. Braun said, although the challenges we're talking about are extremely difficult challenges, however, we're thinking about like what's impossible so that we can move on. Like, that's not the final point, the perfection. We're not like trying to reach perfection, but just the process itself, we can make very invaluable small and big transformations. So theology and the Bible, it becomes the beginning and the ending point of that. So just, yeah, I'm so grateful for this rich conversation, and yeah, I continue to look forward to your future works as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you, and for sharing your brilliant scholarship with us. I don't believe for a moment that any of the three of you have nothing else to say. But I do know that we are at the time limit. I promised that there could be space if somebody wants to hang around and continue to talk, they're welcome to. But we also recognize that we are on the edges of one another's time zones, and some people may be tired from waking up early or staying up late. And so, Dr. Lim, you wanted to close this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your excellent kind of presentation and the scholarly kind of debates. It's really helpful for kind of forming the concept of kind of theology of democracy. Actually, I hate the pandemic. Yeah, just like you. But there must be one benefit from this pandemic, is that based on my location, it is that I can connect it to all of the people kind of across the boundaries. So this format of conference makes us do that which we have never thought about. So we are all globally connected with each other, and we are kind of facing kind of timely issue of kind of theology of democracy which has arisen very recently, but we have rarely kind of tackled yet. So this conference is designed to kind of make some theological response to the kind of the emerging issue of theology all over the places. So thank you so much for your kind of contribution. And at the same time, I would just want to use the word that Adam used this morning for me. So we are performing multi-centeredness in the kind of by doing this kind of work. Actually, the theology has been oriented towards kind of Western kind of centeredness. So we are breaking down. So Yonsei University will continue to kind of contribute to kind of the centeredness of Western theology by creating kind of global discourse this way. So we have the second Yonsei International Conference next year. So please stay in tune for our global collaboration in the name of solidarity across borders. Thank you so much. Well, please join me in a round of applause. Thank you so much for your contribution.